Hello, I'm Krista McAllister, and welcome to Cerius Leadership. Whether you are growing your business, growing your career, or possibly both, thank you for listening. I will say, I love the saying that numbers tell a story, and no one knows that better than my guest today, Matt Wilhelmi. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm looking forward to our chat.
I absolutely just a little bit of basis on your background. You are an expert in organizational development and industrial organizational psychologist. So you kind of come at an organization, the issues somewhat holistically. You can see the whole organization. You also have deep understanding of finance and M&A and operations. So I can see the breadth of our discussion today may zig and zag, and I'm going to keep it on the path as much as I can here. So when you're stepping into companies, you're usually helping them pass some type of challenge they're facing or over hurdle. And I'm sure a lot of information is being given to you, along with a lot of stories to go with them. Where's the first place you usually go to get to the heart of the information, the heart of those stories, and really start to sift through where's the root of the problem that's causing all these stories?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when I begin an engagement with a client, the way that I approach their problems or what they tell me their problems are really kind of sets the tone for everything else. I'm not a consultant that goes in knowing what problems I'm going to face and knowing what solutions I'm going to present. Instead, I've actually got a wide variety of solutions to recommend, and I'm more interested on that front end in getting a lot of the knowledge from the leaders in the business. And so I've actually got a proprietary organizational analysis tool that I've developed over the last 10 years that helps me really dive deep into some of the issues that the leaders are facing, whether it's cash flow, whether it's productivity, whether it's traction and accountability. Whatever the issues might be, my tool actually allows me to get really deep on those topics. And so it covers about 7 different topics that a lot of business owners tend to struggle with and face. And the way that the questions are structured really kind of gets to the heart of what is going on in the business and what's most important to those business leaders.
That's a tough thing because it could be a $5 million business or it could be a $50 million business. And there's a lot of ground to cover. So those questions, you mentioned the way that they're structured. Tell me a little bit more about that and where that's able to really uncover some of the information you're looking for.
Sure. I think in a much larger organization, although maybe you would think that their issues are going to be so much greater and larger and more complex, a lot of the root issues are very similar. And so there's a little bit more data to collect. There's more people to talk to. And so my organizational analysis tool needs to be applied to a wider array of people. But the data that I collect and the process that I go through is the same. I interview and talk with all of the top executives, just about anybody in the organization that has direct reports, because I really want to know, what do they see the issues are in the organization? Not that I don't look at the financials, I absolutely do that. But I think that the financials tell one side of the story. And I'm interested in hearing from the line level employees, from the leaders in the organization that maybe even don't get to see the financials. What do they see as going on in the business? And so from there, then I'm able to create a strategic plan, a prescription almost for their business to, take those next steps and really kind of understanding where are they at today, where do they want to get to, and what's holding them back. That's the point of the organizational analysis.
It's interesting, as you say, sometimes they haven't even seen the financials. They don't have the whole story, but they've got some of that native knowledge going on inside the organization. What are you trying to pull out that's helping you figure out that strategic plan? You've got to know where they want to end up, and you've got to know
Mhm.
where they're at right now. What are some of those tidbits of information that ends up being kind of that golden goose for you or the golden egg?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because it tends to come down to, after a while, getting to know these executives, what are they most frustrated about? Because oftentimes the CFO in an organization, especially if we're talking about a $50 million organization, the CFO, tends to have their finger on the pulse of the financials. And, usually that's shared with the CEO and maybe even the C-suite. But when I'm talking to department managers, directors of operations, even the marketing folks, they don't necessarily have the same set of data to be able to make decisions from. And sometimes that's frustrating because the CFO is saying, hey, we need to hit revenue targets, we need to hit profit targets. And the CEO is usually echoing that and, trying to kind of gather the troops. But then there's a lot of other folks in the organization that are trying their best to make progress, but that is messy. And that's where I really try to get into an organization and understand what is holding back productivity. How do we define productivity? That's usually one of the first things that I work on with clients, is really kind of understanding the big picture from the C-suite, seats, and how they're kind of thinking about the organization. But then when I get down a level or two, how are those folks and their activities really kind of tied in to that bigger picture? What can they control on a day-to-day basis and a week-to-week basis that is going to allow them to feel like, hey, I am actually contributing to the bottom line without having to know all of the ins and outs of the financials? It's really a key part of my process.
It's interesting. You said something that really stood out to me, which is they're using different data, or they're using different information. And we hear that a lot in organizations, especially when there's conflict of anecdotal information, or what we're disagreeing on, we're using different information, we're using different data sets. We may not even be using factual information in order to get to where we are. How are you level setting that information or the data so that we're all going off of the same book? We're all going off of the same information, because I see that disconnect so often in organizations.
Yeah, I see it as well. And it's typically one of those things that holds great organizations back from growing. It's having a really, really great team, if we're going to use a sports analogy, but maybe they're just not all using the same playbook. And if we're going to use a music analogy, maybe it's a chorus, not all singing from the same page of music. And if you can imagine, that would be a little bit clunky. And so one of the ways that I do this is when I work with organizations, I do figure out from the C-suite, what are their most important objectives that they try to hit. Could be revenue targets, could be profit targets, could be cost controlling measures. Whatever those financial metrics are, I do want to understand those. But then I also want to talk with those department managers and those directors, perhaps of operations or marketing, to understand in their world, how do they measure if they're doing well? Because sometimes that report, whether it's a operations report that talks about productivity or WIP or inventory turnover, whatever it might be, is different than the CFO and what their reports are and what they're looking at. And so typically what I do is I'll work with the C-suite and their direct reports to come up with a scorecard. This scorecard doesn't need to be, the fanciest spreadsheet anybody's ever seen. Instead, what I try to do is give everybody a chance to articulate what are the things that they control on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis that they want to measure, that's going to then filter up into those bigger picture goals, whether it's revenue, profitability, things like that. And so when we start to do that, from a psychological perspective, you start to get a lot more accountability. It's actually related to the Hawthorne effect. And so if you're not familiar, the Hawthorne effect is actually a term that got coined back in the 50s by a social psychologist named Dr. French. And he was actually a professor at the University of Michigan. Some people might be more familiar with his work with Raven. They developed this 5 powers of social influence. Don't want to get too sidetracked here. But the Hawthorne effect was this term that he coined after studying these Hawthorne studies, which were actually done in Cicero, which is outside of Chicago. And during these studies, these social psychologists wanted to see if they could adjust the lighting up or down to see if that would affect their productivity of their workers. And what they found is that, yes, in fact, if they increased the lighting or decreased the lighting, the productivity of their workers increased. But then what they also noticed is as soon as that study was over, the productivity went right back to where it was. And so they were almost trying to figure out, well, what happened there? And so what they determined was essentially once the observations stopped, once the accountability stopped, the heightened performance also stopped. And so this Hawthorne effect really becomes, how do we give a little bit more accountability, a little bit more transparency into those operations, into those folks that do have a lot more control in the day-to-day functionality of the business, because they need the accountability to then filter up into growth of revenue, growth of profit, and things like that. And so I think it's a really important term to know, and a really kind of key process that I walk clients through is developing a scorecard that everybody in the organization can then speak to. It gives you a lot more accountability. It gives you a lot more transparency, and you're able to then celebrate wins a lot faster. You're no longer waiting for financial reports months after a period closes, or maybe you don't even see the financial reports like I mentioned. And so this gives you a way to celebrate wins, to hold people accountable, to do performance reviews on a much tighter window, which is going to increase productivity for everybody.
There's the old saying, what gets measured gets managed, what gets managed improves. And it simply from the fact that if we're not keeping score, how do we know if we're winning? The question becomes are we scoring the right thing? Are we measuring the right thing for the outcome that we want? And you mentioned a little bit ago the strategy for the outcome that they want. You're helping to put together that path. In discussions with a lot of CEOs, they've got a scorecard. It may have 5 things, it may have 15 things. That's their scorecard. They don't want the information to be shared with everyone, so that scorecard does not get shared beyond them or their leadership team, and then it stops there. What are your recommendations for getting, whether it's comfortable with sharing those metrics or creating a scorecard for each business unit, or is it one measurement for each role? How do you get that concept throughout the organization without some of those mindset things that we have? Well, there's only one scorecard and I'm not sharing it. There's no way I want everyone seeing that.
Sure. There's definitely a need in some organizations and in a lot of situations to have some privacy over some of the financial metrics in the business. I think that there are some schools of thought where you should share all of the information, all of the financial information with everybody in the company, and I can see a value to that. But I also understand some CEOs that want things to be a little bit more private. But what I would say to your point there, Kristen, is that a great organizational scorecard has a lot of metrics on the bottom, has, not a million, but like maybe 10 to 15 for each department. And then as that gets higher up in the organization, we start to kind of wind those down and get those more narrowed in and more honed in, so that those C-suite executives, those directors, those vice presidents, they're able to have maybe 3 to 5 measures that they're focused on and knowing their wins. And then they understand that their team, perhaps a level down, has more metrics, but as it gets higher up in the organization, you're going to have a little bit fewer. And so a great scorecard has anywhere from 5 to 15, to your point. But I have seen some scorecards with just multitude of measures. And I always wonder if they're all relevant, if they're all actually going to be used in any sort of conversation, or if somebody just said we should measure this and then it was never checked. I think a great way to think about a scorecard is that, hey, we're gonna develop these measures for a while. We're gonna track them for a quarter, maybe 6 months or a year, and then we're gonna revisit it to see if it actually, number one, is something we want to measure. Number two, if it lines up with our organizational objectives. Because here's what we don't want our scorecard to do: become just another checklist and another, time waster that our staff is just spending tons and tons of time working on and dialing into and getting nervous about and worrying about. It's supposed to be an easy, could even be automated. I know there's a lot of softwares out there now that do some automation with their scorecards, but you just want to be able to give enough measure to the staff for them to feel like they're contributing to those bigger objectives.
You mentioned that. I love that you finished on that they feel that they're contributing. The measurement is more or as much for them and our teams to feel like we are winning or we're missing the mark. How do we move forward? Versus, as you've mentioned, it sometimes is used as it's causing stress. We're putting pressure. Accountability is a bad thing. When in fact, so many teams, they want that accountability because otherwise, when you wake up, how do you know what you need to get done that day? And that it fosters so many other things like collaboration. How do you help the organization, depending on their culture, make this a positive? Keeping score and measuring things is good for all, and it's a positive thing. It's not meant to be used as a stick.
A lot of times, the folks that don't want the accountability, they tend not to be the highest performers, and they're kind of maybe hoping that they can hide a little bit. And
Mm.
so I'm not saying that that's true in all cases, but what I would say is that when you give that agency to the people that are developing the scorecard, this isn't something where the big bosses in the ivory tower, commanded, and all of a sudden there's a new scorecard that everybody's never seen before and there's no idea what we're using it for. That's not the way that this works. It's actually a much more collaborative process. And so it would look like, hey, our big picture organizational goals are here. This is what we're looking for, whether it's revenue or profit. And then here's who contributes to them, these different departments. It could be marketing, it could be operations, could be finance, could be sales, whatever it is. But then when you're talking to those leaders of those departments and you're working with those people in those departments, you tend to find, hey, they think that these things are important. And so we should measure that. And because we can see how, hey, when they do XYZ function, guess what? It then translates into revenue. And so one example is an organization I was working with recently. I helped them go from about $3 million a year to $10 million a year in about 18 months. And the way that I was able to do this was with a scorecard. And part of developing that scorecard was building out this process map. And so I call it a functional organizational chart. Essentially, it is a process map that shows how do we generate revenue and how do we generate sales and what processes need to happen in between. And the key here, Kristen, is that once we were able to develop that process map and that scorecard, all of the numbers that went into the scorecard became so obvious. We started tracking things like, hey, when is this project going to be done? And when is this phase done of this project? And because we all want to generate revenue, but now we know exactly what it's going to take from start to finish to create that revenue.
Love it. And sometimes we're tracking the revenue, but as you mentioned, other things go into the revenue. It might be we're launching a new product. It might be we're going into a new region and we need to sign up 10 new distributors. And you start to backtrack what activities need to go into those 10 new distributors. And you're tracking that leading indicator versus revenue is one of the most lagging indicators out there. What are some of those, see a lot of companies struggling with that leading versus lagging when we're measuring things. What are some of those leading indicators that may not jump out or be obvious, or possibly in the project you're talking about, that we know on a day-to-day or a week-to-week basis if we're on track or off track?
Yeah, there's definitely a number of different ways to determine what's a leading indicator that would work in an organization. The analogy that you just created or talked about with, having a new distributor push, that could be as simple as calls to distributors. It's very simple. That is a very much a leading indicator because guess what? You're never going to get a new distributor until you've made some phone calls, or perhaps it's website inquiries if you're going that route. And so whatever it is on the front end of that process, you want to think about all of the steps that it's going to take to get from, we don't have any distributors now, we want 10. And so sure, we can just celebrate when we get a new distributor, but that might take 6 months. It might take 9 months. And you might get all 10 at once. You don't really know. But the leading indicators are those activities that folks would be able to control every day and every week that eventually will produce those results. And so another one might be presentations to distributors. You're not going to close a distributor until you send them a contract, and you're not going to send them a contract until you've got a proposal in front of them that they've agreed to. Well, they're not going to get a proposal until you do a presentation. And so I'm kind of backing into all of those front end activities that lead into financial results.
And I love that who's coming up with those numbers. You didn't say we just need more distributors. We need 10 distributors. Where do you recommend those numbers come from, whether it's being driven by the CFO, the CEO, the C-suite, or the team that's actually needs to go achieve that? Are we backing into them based on here's the number we want, here's all of our assumptions, here you go, the number's 10? Or as you're working with teams, is there input from the individuals who need to go achieve that goal?
Yeah, there's definitely going to be input from the folks because you want to give them that agency. You want to have them feel like, hey, this is something that I agreed to. I think this is the way to go. And it's not that you're not, controlling the big picture and setting these BHAG goals that a lot of C-suite executives do, but you want to give the folks that are making those calls or that are producing your widgets or that are producing whatever it is in your business agency over these metrics. And so absolutely, you would want to talk about, hey, if our goal for the organization is to get 10 new distributors because that's going to generate, $10 million, let's say, because we have data from our other regions that we're in that say that, hey, each distributor should generate X number of revenue. And so this is how we've backed into it. Well, is this a reasonable goal for you? And it's okay to ask this question because if it's not reasonable, I would want to know on the front end of that conversation rather than waiting 6 months and then asking the person, well, how come you haven't hit 10 new distributors? And them tell me, well, they've got all these problems I didn't know about. If you understand their logic in the front end, you can either address it because maybe it's a valid concern, or you can maybe say, hey, that's actually not something that is relevant because of these other numbers and these other data points that we have. But I think that having that conversation on the front end really kind of gives agency to those folks on the front end. And so absolutely, it could be something as simple as saying, hey, if our goal is to get 10 distributors as a department, there's 10 people in the department, that math's pretty easy. What can you contribute? Not just, well, I'm going to get one new distributor, but how many presentations are you going to give? How many phone calls do you think it's going to take you to get your first presentation? And how many presentations until you get your first proposal? And so you're kind of helping them think about this. Now, some organizations certainly have a lot of this data. And so there might be a little bit less, asking these open-ended questions, but I still think it's important to get them behind this movement so that they feel really good about how they're being measured and how they're really contributing to those bigger picture goals.
I love it using the word agency because they might even come back. Someone might come back and say, hey, but 10 is based on an average contract of 200,000. We've talked through it and we know how to get an average contract of 400,000. We now only need 5 distributors, but then this is how we're going to go about it. I think that innovation that I've heard you talk about that comes from the collaboration is so powerful when you're able to look at the organization from an A to Z perspective. And a lot of that I know comes from your knowledge, your experience, and I know you've written a book, Taboo Business Questions. I want to dig into some of those questions and how you came up with what are those questions that we should be asking, shouldn't be asking, or should be asking them every single day.
Well, the book is something that I actually wrote in my early 20s. And my business coach and I were working on this project together in my early 20s and just kind of talking about some of these topics. And we came up with the title of the book, Taboo Business Questions, because business owners sometimes don't even know what questions to ask or how to articulate the questions. And it has nothing to do with how smart they are or how long they've been in business. Sometimes they're just not able to get their brain around some of these topics in the way that once you're able to properly phrase these questions, the solution becomes extremely obvious. And so one example from the book is the chapter on focusing. And so I think that focus is a very hard topic for entrepreneurs, if they're being really honest with themselves, to understand, to be vulnerable, and to admit that, hey, maybe they do need some help with staying focused. And even more important than that, how do they determine exactly what they should focus on to grow their business? A lot of times, Kristen, when I'm talking to business owners, they have this issue where they're trying to grow their capacity. And so they're
Mhm.
doing all these things to hire, they're installing infrastructure, they're setting policies and procedures, and then they also need to get sales at the same time. And so the issue then becomes, well, how do they scale up their sales without having too much work to do and not enough people to do it? And how do they have, enough staff to be able to handle their sales when maybe their sales are lagging a little bit and they've already hired a bunch of people? And so the issue becomes focusing. How do they know what to focus on? And it comes right back into our original topic of scorecards. And, if we're able to really articulate those factors and those things in our business, then we're able to then know, okay, well, this is what I need to focus on today. This is what I need to focus on this week. The answer becomes very, very obvious.
It's shiny object syndrome. I will be the first to admit I've had that. I heard the saying once, a speaker at a conference who said, the biggest killer to success is opportunity. Because we never, as entrepreneurs, you never want to pass up an opportunity. So as those opportunities start to present in front of me, what is the mindset that I should have to rephrase that, to almost put it through another series of questions or an opportunity test, a litmus test of, should I give it 5 minutes, 5 days, or stop right there and walk the other way?
Yeah.
That,
Well,
that's,
I wish
that's
I
a
had a
tough
magic
habit to
answer.
break.
Yeah, I wish I had a magic answer. This is exactly how you do it, because I think that it's very situational and it is very contextual. Because if you're running an organization that is like Apple, for example, guess what? You've got a lot of resources. You've got billions of dollars of cash in the bank. You can go out and do a lot of different things. But a lot of us are not working in an Apple type organization. And so then it becomes, what is your capacity? But I think even more important than that, it's being true to your roots. I don't think it makes sense for a lot of entrepreneurs to get too diverse, too wide until they're really strong in one area. And so that's usually some of the recommendations that I make to newer entrepreneurs is, hey, how do we just stay really, really disciplined in one area? Maybe it's growing your sales. Maybe it's one particular service line or product line, whatever it might be. How do we just knock that one out of the park so that it becomes a machine, so that it becomes automated, so that we don't have to worry about the revenue, the profitability, the functionality of it? It just works. Then we can go and start to diversify a little bit and spend a little bit more energy in other places of the business. But first, you got to take care of that first vertical, that first kind of chunk of your business, making sure it works really, really well.
I was gonna say there might be some questions. If as you're going into an organization and you ask a company, what is it that you do best? What is that one thing that you're able to do over and over and over like a machine? I can imagine you may have to take 10, 15 minutes to think about it, when in reality, it should come out of our mouth because we're talking about it every single day.
Yeah, I think the way that I try to ask that question, Kristen, is a little different, because I think that when you challenge somebody to pick, maybe they weren't prepared for that type of a question,
Mhm.
but you want to get to that answer, you do have to kind of get around it a little bit. And so the way that I do that type of questioning is to really kind of understand, what are we excited about? What can you show me that works well? Do you have reports? Do you have a documented process? If you can't talk to me about a documented process, or if you can't show me that there's, hey, this is the results of this work, some of those basic kind of functionality questions, then you're answering my question that you're not doing it well. And so that's really kind of where I start to qualify that even before I get into a question of, what do you think you're doing well? It's almost like, hey, show me the homework a little bit so that then I can understand your thought process. And actually, Kristen, you can tell a lot about how that question is answered and how they maybe defend their process or talk about their process, the confidence that they have. That tells you a lot about if it's a great process and if it's really working well.
And I see it sometimes we lose that focus where we talk about what we think we are doing and what the road that we've gone down, and we can start to answer that question. And then you could hit me with, what did you intend to be doing well? What should we be doing well? Which goes back to having that clarity of what's our strategy and why are we choosing that strategy and where it's going to get to. Um, I can see how you can talk them through that process of what we're doing well right now. Is this what we intended to be doing? Or was this that opportunistic thing that that's why 60% of our business is that one client?
Yeah, it reminds me of a couple of examples where businesses have ventured out and they've tried new things, and that's okay, right? Like I mentioned, as long as you've got kind of your core business identified, then there is a little bit more room to kind of explore new revenue streams. Maybe it's new profit centers, whatever it might be. And so you do want to kind of embark on those journeys with an acceptable risk in mind. And I think that's a really important term to keep in mind because some people just get so deep into it that they don't even take the time to evaluate how much energy, how much distraction, how much money, how much of their team's focus has been sucked dry from this new shiny object, as you kind of alluded to. And so they then get caught up in, well, we've been trying this for such a long time. I have to have it work. They don't evaluate all of the sunk cost. And so a sunk cost is something in the financial world that is really, really important. It's a fallacy that you should continue to do something just because you've invested so much into it. And that's actually the backwards way of thinking about it. Money you've already invested is gone. You're probably not going to get it back. Unless you can show me a projection and a very realistic one that, is going to turn this around. But it's okay to just call things what they are. And I think that comes back to just being really honest with ourselves and saying something like, man, I tried this, whatever this might be, and I expected it to yield this, and it yielded this. And guess what? This ain't going to work. And so it's okay to scrap it. It's okay to, put some more parameters on it to maybe, limit the exposure to the rest of your organization, but really kind of setting out those milestones is part of that process for evaluating new and different revenue streams.
You said the wear and tear on the organizations, and in order to keep them from, I was speaking with C the other day, so we walked away from millions of dollars worth of business. We had to cut the organization by 25% because it was killing our organization. Servicing this client and in continuing to invest in that was killing our organization and the people in it. You made a great point that it really does impact them. It's not just the numbers.
Yeah. And Kristen, that brings up another really great point. How do you know that as a CEO unless you've got some sort of measurement tool? Perhaps it's an engagement survey. Perhaps it's, just conversations that you're having with your team, candid. Hey, let's grab lunch. I want to just talk to you. And I'm not here to be, there's no agenda other than just to give you a time to tell me what's going on in your world. What are you frustrated about? What are you motivated by? What are you proud of? What can we do better? You start to have some of these conversations, and that's how you keep your finger on the pulse as an executive and as a leader. But a lot of folks don't take that time, and they function on gut, and that gets people into a little bit of hot water because they don't have data. They don't have conversations. They don't get kind of the inside scoop from some of the folks that really they should be listening to because they're the ones on the front lines.
You're mentioning a couple different points of data here. I love my data. It goes into, and those are numbers. It goes into an Excel spreadsheet and I can sort it, whip it, formulate it any way I want. Now you're adding in, hey, your gut is one piece of data, not the one thing you should entirely rely on, but also these conversations, this information. So now you've got a couple different points of data that you're bringing into the conversation here. Is this something that you like to institute on a regular basis? Because it's not natural for everyone, especially entrepreneurs moving fast, moving quick. Two-way communication is not the natural state of being. Is there a championing of that, champion of that sometimes on the leadership team? Or is this a muscle that you work with business owners on to develop over time?
Yeah, well, the best leaders that I've worked with are really great at listening, because we have two ears and one mouth. We should probably be doing more listening. But I think that sometimes as entrepreneurs, we get caught up in the busyness and we see, this person come into work and they're on time and they look busy all day and they leave and, they're happy, we think. And so we don't really think anything of it. But the more we kind of take that for granted, the more resentment builds. And honestly,
Mhm.
there's a lot that isn't said that we should be asking them about. And so, yeah, I recommend quarterly conversations. It's something where if you're a leader of people in an organization, you should spend a dedicated hour with each team member once a quarter. Now, in some organizations that might seem a little crazy because you're managing a humongous team, but really kind of figuring out how can I make this person not just feel special, but give them a platform to give me feedback. And so I already mentioned some of the questions that I recommend asking, but it's really quite that simple. What are you proud of? What are you frustrated by? What can I be doing better? What are you worried about? It's some of these basic questions to just get the conversation going. And if you're a good leader and you're taking notes and maybe you look back on your journal or your time with your staff and you can see trends with that same person, maybe you see
Mhm.
trends among your team because 4 or 5 or 10 or however many people on your teams had the same issues and concerns. Maybe it's worth investigating. But if you don't have those conversations, you're not getting that data, then yeah, you're totally unaware. And so it's a really great exercise to go through with some of the folks that I work with and kind of teaching them this concept because at first, I'm not going to lie, Kristen, it's usually a little awkward. These business leaders, it's just not something they do, and so they're uncomfortable. But over time, what they realize is that value in connecting with their team.
I can absolutely see that. And that's where the scorecard may look great because it's a team scorecard and there's a couple individuals on the team that may not be contributing. And that's one of the fastest ways to lose the most valuable people is that they're carrying the load. And that's that feedback, that team input, what's behind the numbers is what you're suggesting. I can see how valuable that can be into that data collection.
Yeah, I think it goes a little deeper because the scorecard is going to show you activity, and you can have somebody giving you all of the best activity, and the scorecard looks great, but they're never happy. They maybe they gossip. Maybe they're frustrated about something they could be doing even better on their scorecard, but they have this other thing going on, whatever that might be, because you haven't asked them about it, you don't know. And so they're literally being held back. And so once you start to have those conversations, you also then drop kind of the numbers side of it, and you say, hey, like, yes, we're going to talk about performance numbers in a second, but let me find out how you're doing. How are you doing? And you make it a lot more personable, and you find out things about your staff that way.
Love it. And in gathering that information, that data, we're able to pull all back to what we're looking to accomplish. We talked about that taboo business question of focus. Are we focused on the right thing? What's another one of your either the most common ones that you face in organizations or maybe one of your favorite questions, taboo business questions that you talk about?
Yeah, in my book, there's 7 different topics. But one of the other topics is about empowering. And I think it's really important for business leaders to really kind of ask this taboo business question, which is, how do I know the best way to empower my staff? Because that doesn't always look the same to everybody. I want to give you a quick example because there's actually transformational leadership is kind of this hot topic that a lot of people are talking about. And in some of the coursework that I've completed in my master's program, we do talk about this concept. And so transformational leadership really kind of comes from 4 different I's. The first one's idealized influence. The second one's inspirational motivation. The third one's intellectual stimulation. And the fourth one is individualized consideration.
Mhm.
And guess what? Not everybody needs all 4 of the exact same. It's not like a perfect 25%, 25%, 25% kind of construct. Some people need more inspirational motivation, and some people need more idealized influence. And some people need more individualized consideration. Some people don't want any individualized consideration. They're good. And so until you get to talk to your team, you're not going to know which one's best for them. And so that's really where the taboo topic comes in of how do I empower my team? Well, the answer is it depends on how your team needs to be empowered. It looks different for everybody.
It reminds me of the platinum rule. Do unto others as they would have you do unto them. You can't manage everyone the same way. You can't inspire them the same way. You can't empower them the same way. How do they want to be empowered, and what do they value and what's meaningful to them? Going back to what we were just talking about, that two-way communication and listening, what are some things that you recommend for leaders to uncover for each individual that they're working with, mentoring, leading? What does inspire and empower them?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to connecting with them. I mean, if you build a relationship, you could be as bold as just asking them, hey, do you feel like you maybe need more one-on-one attention? Or do you feel like maybe you need more group, accolades? And some people, they don't want any group accolades. They don't want to be acknowledged in front of their team because it's like the craziest thing that they've ever thought of. And like that's like a very legitimate thing that you should know as a leader. I remember working with one leader where he just, he had this great concept of like superlative awards. And so every month he created this series of awards for his team just to kind of keep them motivated, most enthusiastic. I mean, he came up with all these crazy ones. And a few of his team members were extremely uncomfortable to the point where like they didn't really engage with this process. And he thought there was something wrong with them. Well, it's not wrong with them. They were embarrassed. They didn't want to accept these types of awards because that's just, maybe it's a culture thing. Maybe it's how they were raised. Maybe it's a self-confidence thing, whatever it might be. You have to know your team really, really well before you can really kind of get into what motivates them, because that's going to be different for everybody.
I'm hearing a lot as we talk about the current generations in the workforce and those up and coming is this concept of customization to rewards, to compensation, to benefits, to just about anything that normally we'd say, here's the makeup of our workforce, here's what we're going to do for them. It's that customization on almost an individualized basis that I hear coming about as we're leading forward.
Yeah, the younger generation, and I think I can say that now, I'm in my mid 30s. The younger generation in their early 20s and even in their late 20s, it seems like there's a general consensus that there's two big things that they want. The first is they want to be heard. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and not like in a booming voice, look at me, but they want an outlet. How can they contribute to the bigger picture if they're not heard? They really want to be heard. And the second one, which is very, very close, is valued. They want to know that what they're working on has value. They want to understand, how does my activities, my functions in the business translate into what you're working on? Because I want to be part of something. I want to work on this really cool project with you, but I got to kind of know a little bit of how it works. And for a long time, that has not been the case in the workplace. I remember when I was first entering the workforce, you did your job, you didn't ask too many questions, you kind of flew under the radar.
Yeah.
And if you did ask questions, it was like, oh my gosh, don't ask questions. You're not supposed to. But our younger generation is bold and they're interested and they're engaged. I would love to have a staff who wants some of those things, that wants to be heard, that wants to understand how their work fits into that bigger picture so that there's value there for them. Because guess what? When there's value, they're going to work harder. Who doesn't want that?
Absolutely, because you know that your work is making an impact in that. So we've talked about some of those type of business about focusing and being able to empower, and we've talked about the scorecard that ties into what are the outcomes we want, what's the destination we want. But we all know that things don't always go smoothly. What are some of those pitfalls or those just progress killers that you find we run into when we're growing our business it just almost stops everything or gives us those challenges to inhibit the progress that we're making or where we want to get to? What's some advice on those things to avoid that's going to either stop us in the track, kill our team, all this work we've done, it's just going to be for nothing? What should we be avoiding?
Yeah, well, I want to use a sports analogy. I played football for a long time, and we're entering football season here shortly. And so, my analogy is that of a sports team. You want to have your best players on the team being the hardest workers. And generally, the most gifted athletes, if they're not the hardest workers, that causes a very big problem in the organization. They get labeled like prima donnas. They get labeled with things like, they're just here for the paycheck. But you really want as an organization to be dialed into who are our best players and are they working the hardest? And that doesn't mean that everybody's not working hard, but if you're the CEO of the organization, for example, and you're constantly missing deadlines and you're, delaying accountability or you're making excuses, that kind of filters down into the culture of your organization. And you could really just shoot yourself in the foot. Some of the best organizations that I've worked with have the hardest working leadership team. They come in early. They understand the reports. They're dialed in when they're at work. It's not that it's their entire identity in their life, but they work the hardest. And you can tell by their effort, by their conversations, by the way that they inspire others around them. That's really kind of the way to create a positive culture. And again, on the reverse side of that, if you've got a bunch of folks that aren't being held accountable, everybody sees that they're slacking off and maybe they're not being, called out for bad performance. That sour apple does tend to ruin the batch.
What are some advice for making sure that we're staying on track, that we're hitting our metrics, and that we're remembering to do the things that we know we should be doing? Sometimes are the hardest things to be doing.
Well, I think in business, it's easy to, especially for entrepreneurs, if there's a solo entrepreneur out there listening to this, it is easy as a solo entrepreneur to go somewhere very, very fast. But when you start to build a team and you start to have people, report to you or that are collaborating with you, you're going to not go as fast. And I think it's important to remember that because you're going to go a lot further if you're working with great people. There's, the saying of, you're the average of the five closest people to you. Well, if those five closest people are not, high achievers and they're not pushing you and motivating you and growing you, then you might need to find a new group to be growing with. And so my advice to entrepreneurs is really kind of when they're selecting talent to really kind of understand how is this going to work for the long term? Because that's where we all should be in business. It's not a sprint, it is a marathon.
You've given us a lot of great advice and insights on how do we get the infrastructure set up? How do we know where we want to end up? And really get that scorecard to get there and focus on where we should be spending our time, getting it operating like a machine, and empowering our teams to help us get there. What other piece of advice would you give us to help stay on that track? Because it's so easy to get distracted, that shiny object syndrome, and it's so easy to get caught up sometimes and lost in that destination that we originally wanted to get to and why we wanted to get there. Maybe some parting pieces of advice to help us stay on that path that we charted.
Yeah, I think that staying focused is one of the more challenging topics these days. We all have phones that are constantly trying to distract us and updates from random platforms. And, anyway, I think that the way that we can kind of cut through a lot of that and stay really laser focused is honestly keeping an old school checklist. And at the top of the checklist should be your big picture goals. Right below that is what you're going to accomplish this quarter. And then, hey, here's what my week's going to look like. It's almost taking just a little bit of strategic time as a leader, typically on a Monday morning. Some people do it on a Sunday night, whatever your preference is, but to really kind of plan out your week. What do I want to accomplish? What am I going to stay focused on? But here's the key, Kristen. What am I going to do to be successful this week? If you can answer that question for yourself, whatever that looks like, that you can control, you're going to have a successful week. You just need to define it for yourself.
And as you talked about empowered, what am I going to do to help my team be successful this week as well? And
Exactly.
it all ties together. Thank you so much. We'll make sure that we include a link to your book in the show notes. I appreciate you being on Serious Leadership and sharing your leadership insights. They are tremendous.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I appreciate the time.